I'm Bev Neufeld. Hello, I'm Bev Neufeld. I'm president of POWHER New York. We are a network of over 100 organizations. We're from all parts of the state. We represent different issues and different constituencies, but we come together for the shared agenda of attaining women's economic equality. We're working for women, for people of color, for gender expansive individuals, and we do this through systemic and culture change. We're so excited about today's panel. It's actually the second in a series, and we want to thank our partners, ILR Workers Institute and the Sexual Harassment Working Group, for all the coordination you did with us. Before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. You know where the chat feature is, and please put any questions that you have in the chat. The bios of our wonderful panelists will be in the chat. If you have a question, put it in the chat or in the question and answer feature. And then if you're using social media, please use @POWHERNY. If you need us, just write us at info@POWHERNY, and someone is monitoring that. Today's conversation is grounded in the collective work of this large network. And it's represented in a document called A Roadmap to Create Inclusive Gender Justice in New York. It was authored by 50 organizations over Zoom during the pandemic. And it really creates the statement of a paradigm shift, our vision for the future, and a plan of action. This sexual harassment series is linked to that document. And it's a deeper dive into two sections: gender-based violence and employment. You can find that online. You can also find the first of our series online as well, and that took place in June. That was before we had a transition to a new governor. But this discussion and all this work is really not about one person or one incident or one branch of government. It's about ongoing, historic, and persistent sexual harassment in government and in other seats of power. The purpose is to punish those who seek a seat at the table because of their gender identity, their sexual orientation, their race, or their background. We know the effects on those who are the victims are career-changing, economically devastating sometimes, and even life-altering. So what can we do to change this? Today, we are going to address the role of men play in ending sexual harassment in all workplaces. We have 4 outstanding speakers, and to kick us off, I want to introduce our expert moderator, and that's Karen King. Karen is the Commissioner of Public Advocacy of Erie County. She's also the executive director of the Erie County Commission on the Status of Women, and I'm proud to say she's a POWHER New York board member. Karen, take it away.
Thank you, Bev. Hello, everyone. Happy Thursday, and thank you to our stellar panelists for participating in today's conversation. Despite legislative action, gender justice advocacy efforts, and the proliferation of awareness trainings and workshops, sexual harassment remains saliently entrenched in institutional systems, including politics and government. The good news is that these collective efforts are making a difference. We are witnessing a culture shift in accountability and action with regard to holding the perpetrators and the larger culture accountable in unprecedented ways. This shift is due in large part to the courageous work of survivors and their willingness to share their stories under the most vulnerable and transparent circumstances. They selflessly laid the foundation for this work to continue. And we know that we can't fully eradicate the culture of sexual harassment without the participation of men in this work. This must be the work of men. Today, we call on our male allies to offer insight and recommendations on how to engage men in taking on a key role in dismantling the systems of patriarchy and male privilege that keep the culture of sexual harassment in place. So I welcome all of you to the discussion today. And I am going to start by introducing our first panelist, Senator Gonardis, represents the 22nd District in Brooklyn, but he is a champion for all New Yorkers in his dedication to fight sexual harassment and corruption in Albany. Welcome, Senator Gounardes. There you are. Hello. I'm going to pose the first round of questions to all the panelists, and then we will come back and have more of a conversational roundtable. So the first question to you, Senator. You stated in an August 2021 opinion piece in the New York Daily News that meeting this moment takes more than just legislation, and it takes more than just calling it out when we see it. Please share some ways, in addition to legislation, elected officials can challenge and dismantle sexual harassment and change the political landscape through enacting real and sustained culture change.
Well, thank you so much, Karen. And it's great to be with you all here this evening for this great conversation. I think it's when I said that it's more than just calling it out when you see it, or it's more than just calling for the passage of specific bills. Those things are obviously very, very important, because that's how we continue to highlight and find the most egregious types of behavior that exist, and really condemn it and really try to stamp it out. But the hard work comes in between the moments that make it onto the front page of the paper. The hard work comes in having conversations when it's not in the news about what type of workplace culture you are cultivating for your own employees, for the employees that interact with you. It's about creating safe spaces where people know, both when it's a hot button issue, and even when it's not, that there is a safe space where people can come forward. They can talk about what's happened to them in their workplace. They can talk about concerns, questions, issues, problems. They feel like they have a trusting environment where they can do that in. And it's also about taking the burden off of survivors, which most times, though not it's always, are women. Oftentimes we rely on women to kind of bear the burden of having to navigate the conversation around sexual harassment. And, that's problematic because that's exhausting work to do. And so I think it's incumbent upon men, or also just leaders in offices, not just in elected office, frankly, but just generally speaking, to find ways, both big and small, to shoulder some of that burden, initiate some of those conversations, both with people who might be survivors and also with everyone else. And I think by creating those spaces and creating that trust and creating those relationships, you then set the tone for an office culture and a workplace culture that doesn't have to get to a point where you have to then call it out when you see it. Because then you set the tone from the very beginning that this type of behavior not only is to be condemned, you don't even allow it to foster, because there's no place for it to root itself. That's really what I meant when I wrote that last month.
Thank you. I like that analogy. There's no place for it to root itself. That's a great way to understand it. Thank you. Our next panelist, Quentin Walcott, is the executive director of Connect New York and has engaged men and boys over the past 22 years as allies and activists in the movement to prevent intimate and gender-based violence, particularly in marginalized communities. Welcome, Quentin.
Thank you for having me.
Many training programs and workshops addressing sexual harassment offered to businesses are rooted in compliance and the prevention of lawsuits. What are some ways we can shift this focus to one that addresses culture change, including challenging and dismantling patriarchy and male privilege?
Thank you for that question. That's a great question and a great framing question. And I like what was said. The senator said a lot of great things about, taking the onus and responsibility away from the person who's receiving the harm. And that's primarily women. And it's so important that, men are involved in this way, not in a check off the box way in terms of protecting property, protecting the bottom line, which is, making money for this organization, if that is the mission. But I think it's important to really look at who's most impacted by this, right? And that's typically women in the workplace. That's people that are not as privileged as men are. in a lot of ways, and heterosexual men and those in positions of power in the workplace. So I think it's important that those who are impacted are involved in this, not as an add-on or at a seat at the table once you kind of develop policy and protocol, but from the very, very beginning, because they are most impacted by that. And we really need to, and men in particular, really need to understand how our privilege and entitlement and power shows up in the community, and also particularly in the workplace, particularly in workplaces where traditionally and historically these are men that are in these positions historically, and these kind of, and the policies are really built around what is the historical nature of the workplace, the positions that exist. And we have, more and more women that are coming into the workplace and that are in and should be in leaders and positions of power and leaders of organizations. But the kind of like the institutionalized fabric of the policy in the workplace and ultimately the culture is what really prevents levels of equality. I mean, the struggle is equality, but we also ultimately want mutuality in terms of how the culture of the workplace works. So I think, and it was also mentioned earlier that it's not about the one individual, right? We have to move beyond that's just one person. That person becomes the scapegoat for the entire culture, or the policy, or the protocol, or the organization. It's very easy and simple to do that. And when we do that, we're just basically putting a Band-Aid on the issue and not looking at the root causes and what is it about this culture that despite a policy that may exist, it may look very good on a bookshelf, but it has dust on it and it hasn't been looked at for many, many years. So these need to be, just like how manhood works and leadership works, that needs to be ongoing. It needs to be something that you look at and examine and figure out, what does accountability look like? And that's not just accountability in terms of what the policy says, or the way that we can cover this up so we're not giving organizations or unions or whatever it may be, negative attention. We have to really look beyond the institution, look at the culture, look at those who are mostly impacted by this. And then also for men who are involved in this and are doing harm indirectly and just kind of as silent bystanders, we need to kind of look at, how does our power work? How does our privilege work? How does our entitlement work? And what roles are we playing to really perpetuate the status quo of the culture where we benefit from it, if we're active involved in the change or the transformation or not. But it's really about that transforming the culture of the organization. So I love the fact that we've titled this conversation that really about the culture change, because that is the only way things will stick. Because you could have a great policy developed by a small group of people and you think it's great, but then at some point, when you try to put it into practice as a reactionary thing rather than a preventative way, it will fall into a lot of trouble around that. And that's when the liability and all those things that companies or corporations worry about will come into play. But we really have to be preventative. We have to include those who are most impacted by this. And, and also, like was mentioned, taking the onus and responsibility of those who are being harmed, because that is part of the culture. If I talk about what's happening to me, fear of retribution, the person who is doing harm to me may be so valuable to that organization that, they will be believed because they have not just value as a man, but probably a value as a special skill or that they're bringing to the organization as a speaker, as an organizer, as a great leader. And you don't want to jeopardize that so much. But every time we don't respond effectively and create a safe work environment, we're really doing so much harm down the line. So it's really about taking some time and effort to look at what are the root causes of what's going on, how is the culture harmful, what role do men, women, and witnesses play in this? Because I think witnesses and those who are bystanders can be the ones who can really, really shift the needle around transformation of the work culture.
Thank you, Quentin. Yeah, we'll spend a little time talking about the process of complicity and the role that bystanders can play in this work. Thank you. Gary Barker. Gary is the CEO and founder of PROMUNDO US and has advanced gender equity and positive masculinities around the world, advising the UN, World Bank, numerous national governments, and key international foundations and corporations on strategies to engage men and boys in promoting gender equity. Welcome, Gary Barker.
Hey, Karen, how are you?
Not too bad for a Thursday. We are so excited to have you join us, and you have been doing this work for quite some time, really at the forefront of this work back before it was even, quote, fashionable. So thank you for your long-term commitment. PROMUNDO is at the forefront of designing programs that challenge traditional ideas about masculinity. How do we get more men invested in creating and promoting and sustaining scalable models that reimagine masculinity and gendered power dynamics?
Oof, yeah, great question, and thank you for that, Karen. Kind of, yeah, how do we take on the power at its roots? You know, the question in the middle of that of how to get men invested, I'm going to start with a glass half full response to that, which is I think most men are on our side. And when we've done surveys, whether in a given workplace or nationally representative stuff, men tell us, at least in intentions, 85% say they want to do everything they can for gender equality, either at home or in their workplace. Now, if we ask women in the same places, are men doing everything for gender equality in those spaces? Only about half of women say yes, that men are. But the good news is, the half full, is that most men get this. What is about good humanity and respect for rights and full equality? Most men seem to be on our side. And part of the question, I think, is how do we look at men in ways that we can draw them into this conversation? And I think, to acknowledge that big gap between intentions and reality, I think part of what we have to do is sort of look at men as walking around with a shirt on that says awaiting instructions. Let us give to men really clear things of what we need men to do for this. Vote for politicians who believe in equality. Speak up with women at your workplace or in your community when inequalities are made known and clear. Demand transparency in your workplace in terms of pay and hiring. Demand equitable parental leave. Take it and use it. March. How many of the marches do we go to that we are a handful of male-identified individuals? I want to see men at the marches as well. Now, there's a delicate issue there that's quite important, which is that sometimes men coming will say, okay, I'm here to fix it, as opposed to say, no, I'm here to listen and to be part of and to honor and follow the work that so many women have led for so many years. So I think one of it is that let's be clear to men what we need to achieve this equality. The other part is, I think, to pick up on some words that Quentin used before around prevention. I mean, if we use the model of public health, let's look at the roots of this disease of harassment. We know that it's women's inequality compared to men, political and social power. We know that it's harmful ideas about manhood, what we either call the man box or toxic masculinity or unhealthy masculinity. We know that childhood experiences of violence, witnessing violence, growing up as a driver. We know that the lack of accountability, men who think they can get away with it are more likely to use it. If those are the things we've got to change, if those are the root causes, then how do we go upstream for the prevention? That means mandating gender transformative education, whether that's after school programming, in school programming, any new worker coming in, any military recruit, anybody joining state houses as staff and otherwise. Let's make that mandatory. We've got lots of great evidence-based curricula out there that work at that level. Bystander approaches, what Quentin was just mentioning, making those really clear, what we want you to do when you see it. That, again, is a late response. We want to go even further upstream. Restorative justice approaches. It is not just enough to do our classic NDAs. There's so many cases of harassment that simply get washed away, and we miss the learning experience to say we held someone accountable. That's less difficult in political spaces. It's really difficult in the workplace. We need known and enforced guidelines that have to be in place. They have to be obvious. They've got to be seen as having teeth and working. Leadership training so that everybody from the top on down knows what is expected from them. And then I'll end on a point of starting young. These ideas of unhealthy masculinity, we are raising them in our sons. We've seen in some of our survey research with young men ages 18 to 30 that up to 30% had done some kind of harassment in the physical world, in the analog world, or online in the last month alone. It is in the water just how often comments, the lesser forms of harassment, but that are insidious and go on every day unchecked are there. We've looked at it on video games. We've looked at it on online spaces, not to mention what happens in the physical spaces that we live and interact with. Our sons see this. And the only way that we're going to flip that around is when we start even younger to promote healthy boyhood. And I love what the senator said of, so that it's obvious that this goes against the grain of what our common humanity is about. We have an initiative called the Global Boyhood Initiative that's working with partners in a few countries to make this part of how we talk to boys ages 4 to 13, building it into after school programming, something we're doing together with the Boys and Girls Club of America, making it just everybody needs to have a conversation about healthy masculinity, what we expect, how we call it out when harm is done, and modeling what we mean by good, healthy behavior. And I think the other is to say there's a wealth of resources in this country of good programming. Quentin talked about the work they've been doing for 20 plus years. There's a call to men. There's Futures Without Violence. There's the MVP work. There's Men Can Stop Rape. There's the White Ribbon Campaign. There's It's On Us. There's a lot of stuff out there. And I think we have ethically, and we've got to look at the really great programming that's out there and say, do we have the political will to make this and take this everywhere? And then finally, just to say, I think this is uncomfortable for most men to talk about. A conversation around harassment, around inequality, most men suddenly find their shoes very interesting, or the back of the room, or the phone, anything but make me talk about power and privilege and the harm that some men do. And I think what we've got to do is to help men find our stake in gender equality, that a workplace, a street, a community, a household where women and girls and individuals of all gender identities are safe is a place where we live better as cisgendered men, where everyone lives better. And I think to make that clear, I think we've done a disservice to ourselves. It's easy because of the need to call out that we forget to call men into this conversation of gender equality and this feminist discussion. Let us be okay to say that F word. This is good for us as men. We live better. We have better relationships, better partnerships. We feel less fear from other men when we promote a full feminist agenda. And so I also want our boys and our sons to grow up thinking feminism is not a bad word. In fact, it's a state of humanity that all of us need to strive to. So I'd like to leave that message there. I want to see men having a stake, having skin in this game, saying not ownership over, but co-ownership. I want men to feel I've got a stake in this and I can't sit on the sidelines about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Lots to talk about in that response, and we'll have some time when we get into our roundtable. Thank you for that. Stanley Fritz is the political director for Citizens Action of New York. He brings a strong background in communications and community organizing to addressing critical areas of racism, gender-based discrimination, violence, and injustice. And Stanley, it's great to see you again. You're on mute. Stanley participated in our initial roundtable over the summer and just really brought forth some really compelling ideas. So we're so thrilled to have you join us again. So welcome.
Hi, Karen.
Stanley, you have discussed the need to shift the sexual harassment training model from compliance to accountability, and that men need to shift their diets from one of patriarchy and male privilege to healthy and collaborative forms of allyship with women. Share some strategies on how we can make this happen.
Sure, thank you. And thanks for having me back again. It's been really cool to listen to all the people talking. So I think the first thing that we kind of have to like bottom line is that patriarchy and sexism and gender-based discrimination hurts men just as much as it hurts women. And I think one of the reasons why you see there are men who agree and support these issues in theory, but not actually supporting it in process is because too many of us still see ourselves as like an outsider, like, damn, that's messed up. Somebody should do something about it, instead of thinking, wow, by helping this sister or this feminine identifying person, I'm also helping myself because our liberation is tied to each other. And then the way that we do sexual harassment is not even about a damn, that's messed up, we should protect women and protect people from harassment. It's, wow, what are some ways I can make sure that my organization does not get sued, or I do not get fired, or I do not get quote unquote canceled? And these trainings represent that. And, you know, we have to do trainings every single year, and the trainings are always like pretty comical and confusing because they'll have that really weird skit where they bring up a scenario that probably wouldn't actually happen. And instead of pointing out the issues there and how we get there, they just tell you how to not do it. And if you actually want to be an ally, and if you actually want to start addressing the issue of harassment, gender-based harassment, patriarchy, sexism, you have to shift your focus from not trying to get sued and or canceled and or fired to like, what kind of fundamental shifts do I have to make in order to be a better person, right? And the first piece is about seeing the humanity in women. I think that far too many of us don't see the humanity in women. We see women for what they can do for us. We see our mothers as the women who gave birth to us and who breastfed us and who are gonna laugh at our corny jokes and tell us we're successful, right? And that's our moms. And then we look at other women based on how they make us feel, whether that is a sexual way, whether it's the ego way, or whether it's an emotional way. But too many men, myself included, and this is a work in progress for me, I am not perfect. Too many men are looking at women as these ideas, not as fully fleshed human beings. And if you can't see someone as a fully fleshed human being, you cannot empathize with them. And if you can't empathize with them, you cannot relate to them. And if you cannot relate and empathize, how can we have our liberations tied together? The same problem we have with patriarchy and sexism is the same problem we have with white supremacy. White people can't see their liberation through Black liberation, so they definitely can't support it. So that's why they get upset about critical race theory. Now, about shifting that diet, and I'll be fast, I know I've been talking a lot. Instead of having a workshop where we say, maybe don't look at Sally's butt because you can get sued, we start asking the question of like, what are some ways that we should be engaging with people on our staff that feel humane? What are some things that you would feel comfortable about? How do power dynamics work in a workspace? And how do people from different experiences experience these power dynamics? And instead of just having it be a one-off workshop, it'd be a continuous conversation about behavior, about humanity, about consent, about agreement, about community. If we're doing that consistently, you're gonna get some people that push back because of course, listen, I pushed back when I was a 10-year-old kid and my dad was like, hey, Stan, you gotta wear deodorant. I pushed back hard until the other kids stopped hanging out with me because I smelled like I wanted to be by myself. So there's gonna be a couple of musty dudes with ashy elbows who don't wanna be a part of this process, but a lot more people are gonna see the value in it. And the good thing about diets is if you stop calling it a diet and you actually just change your behavior and change the way you eat, you start to feel better, you start to look better, and all those old habits that you have become less and less appealing. And all of a sudden, because it feels like it's a part of your life, it doesn't feel like work anymore, it just feels like it is. And that's what we should be aspiring to do. My goal is to like hopefully have conversations with men that not only help them see their need to be invested in this, but also why. And I try to connect it to my own personal story because, you know, like every single man has said or done something inappropriate or been inappropriate, but it's really embarrassing and hard to say. So what if somebody was like, yeah, I was that guy who made the creepy comment, that was really messed up, here's how I'm changing, here were the impacts. That might inspire other people to do it. And if we're all doing that, I think we're gonna be in a good direction.
Thank you, Stanley. Behavior modification, right? Great comments. Thank you for responding to that first go round of questions. So I just want to follow up with some questions to all of you, and you can just jump in, and then we will open it up to our attendees who are flooding our chat box with questions, and Mary's going to facilitate some of the questions to me. But, you know, what I'd like, for you all to come back on camera. You know, I heard a couple reoccurring themes, you know, this idea that, you know, men have to step up and we can't continue, or you can't continue to expect women to shoulder this. And then there was, I think it was Gary who made the comment about the T-shirt with instructions needed, you know, with some kind of literally a roadmap. And I think you all spoke about modeling the way or the behavior, and the idea of starting with boys, right? And because you think about this process as a pipeline, but then of course, you know, boys go home at night and they interact with their family. So how, I mean, does this work have to, how do we create spaces and institutional settings for this work to happen, right? In sites of education and sites of work. What are some ways we can reinforce it, you know, in our home, in our larger world with the people that we care about and are close to and interact with?
I could start with that. I love what Gary said and Stanley said. A lot of what we try to build into what we call trainings and workshops we've done in the workplace, you know, it's really conversational. It's like, you know, throwing away the traditional modalities and really having a conversation and sharing your narrative. And, you know, when I started this work many years ago, I started with youth, right? And, you know, with that same thinking, and I think it's correct, you know, the earlier the better. But the reality was that when I started doing this work and my team that I've worked with over the years, is that young people collectively have power and influence, but ideally they don't have the power to change their material conditions. So with that, it's important, of course, to talk about gender and masculinity and all of these concepts, of course, age appropriate and language they can understand. But what I found out was that while they were with me, either in a clinical or non-clinical, mostly just kind of in a community model way, as soon as they went home, like you said, Karen, is that they're back in their community, they're back around the negative influences of masculinity or men that may be around them, or this ideology around, men are the center and the central piece around society in different locations and community. So it's so important that, yes, you work with young people, but then you also work with the adults in their lives, right? And I even shifted away from working with young people to work with particularly adults and parents and communities, and using community organizing and restorative justice practices to be in these conversations. But it was so important to work with men, right? And because the men that are connected to that person's community, if the father or whatever male figure is not in the home, they yield to whatever form of masculinity that's most consistent and present in their life. And that can be a very unhealthy one, right? And I believe, kind of like the diet conversation, is that I believe in this menu of masculinity, so that there's different types and forms that young people, boys and girls, can choose from. I like what this thing that Q has going on. I like what Gary said. I like what the senator said. I like the aspects of the senator's masculinity or manhood or leadership. Same with Gary, same with Stanley, and same with, in all the women in people's lives that are sometimes more consistent in their lives. But when we kind of like make things about masculinity versus femininity, man versus woman, mother versus dad, and, just the traditional binary system, we become very limited and narrow. So I think it's important that whatever children, whatever adults in their lives, and then whatever location men in particular are, right? I remember starting doing this work and running men's groups in a barbershop, right? I don't get my hair cut anymore, but that was where my mother took me and my brother and, would leave us there. And the first thing the barber would say to us was, how do women treat you? And we're like, 3 and 4 years old, not even understanding what he's talking about. But you could tell from the images and the conversations that happen in the barbershop, which is like the church. You hear everything there. That's the central place in communities. So you have to be in a barbershop, creating these dialogues and these conversations, and not preaching to the choir, but sharing your story, listening, right? the communication needs to be really there. 70% listening, 30% your input. That's how you really move the needle and hear people's stories and you connect them. And like, to what I think Gary and Stanley were talking about is that part of it is about patriarchy, male supremacy, but it's all the other systems of power that come into shape and form for multiple people. So the intersectionality of the forms of oppression, like my work is on the intersection of race and gender. And that's just the beginning point. That's my entry point. But then you have to look at all the other isms and dynamics that people are experiencing in their communities. And yes, we have to ally with women, right? But at the same time, and Gary knows this from 20, 30 years of this work, is that what can tend to happen is that we create a whole nother job for women to teach us, to check on our work, to hold us accountable, and all these other things. We want to be in positions where we can be accomplices and allies, so we're not creating a whole nother form of work, the 24/7 work, the 9-to-5 work, and then holding men in this work accountable. We want to be able to kind of, and the reality is that once I think someone mentioned it, and what's been helpful to me in my work is that showing men how this impacts them, right? And male violence impacts men more than it impacts women, to be honest, almost 3-to-1. So we have to kind of look at that and what is it about masculinity, how we're raised, how we're socialized, how we benefit in society, and putting it in perspective and context. I work internationally. Gary knows we've done work in Brazil and the continent of Africa, different places. But right here in New York City, putting the work in context. I work primarily with men of color and families of color and poor folks, right? So that the context of how you engage them in conversation is very different, and it's very different from what works in Brooklyn may not work in the South Bronx. So you have to put in context, build it up from the ground up, and also policy and protocol from up to down. Multiple things need to be done, right? But we really need to be informed by again, folks who are impacted the most by this. That's so critical and crucial as our guiding post or guiding light in this.
Thank you, Quentin. There was a lot there, and thank you for not wanting to create another layer of work for women. I appreciate that. So really, what this really speaks to how this really needs to be an ecosystem, right? And we have to really understand the landscape and how to best connect with men. And are men the best agents to connect with other men, Senator?
I feel like my answer to that is both yes and no. I think for me, as I interact with this work and with this conversation, I view it through the lens of of power dynamics, right? Especially in politics, just generally, it's about power, right? And power comes from how people view their relationships, to other people vis-a-vis those people. More often than not, there are men in positions of leadership. More often than not, you have men in elected office or in, the halls of power. And so, how do you break down this conversation through the lens of power dynamics to people that understand it? In some ways, it is easier for one person who has responsibility and has power to communicate that to someone else who has power. But on the other hand, I feel like asking the question in that way also limits it and kind of says that only people can talk on the same level to each other. And I feel like that's the wrong way to think about the question. So, I think, as I kind of, intersect with this concept, it's really about how do you chart the power dynamics that exist, like a power map, and figure out what influences and what moves people in different positions, and how do you get people in power to change their views or to understand their dynamics and the exercise of their power in different ways. Sometimes that might be relating, man on man. Sometimes that might be finding an outside influence, whoever that may be or whatever that may be. It might be an institution. It might be, some other source that can exercise leverage in those conversations. That's how I think we should really be thinking about this question. And, that helps then lay the groundwork for what the what the dynamics are right now. It also helps paint the path forward for how you can go about not just changing the system at large, which is I think a large part of the conversation we're trying to have here, but also to really it's going to take one by one. We're not going to be able to flick a switch and say, if every man talks to every other man using these 10 keywords, all of a sudden we'll have solved this problem, right? It's like we have to get to each individual person while also changing the whole system at large. And so you got to think about it in those terms. And that's where I think, being very thoughtful and intentional with who the credible messengers are, who the people that are trying to lead this conversation, why they're trying to lead this conversation, and what tools or media or messages they're using to communicate. I think too, maybe Stanley was making the point, how this actually, making the point about how harassment actually hurts men as well. You can very easily imagine a context where you have someone that you interact with who has a problem, someone who is abusing their power vis-a-vis subordinates or other people in their lives. The conversation with them is like, hey, you're going to get yourself into a lot of trouble. You're going to cause yourself more pain than you realize. You have to wake up. That's a different conversation than someone else maybe when you're talking to a 10-year-old boy or someone in our homes or someone in our families. Like, you have to think about it from different angles and different perspectives. So that was a bit of a long-winded answer, but I think it really depends context specific how we go about initiating these conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. And that really brings to light why these training programs can be so challenging, especially when they're delivered en masse, to a staff of 1,000 people who have to take a video training and click the box, right? There's not a lot of room for nuance or understanding your audience. So that can really only supplement this other work that, we have to all be engaged with. Gary, do you want to share some thoughts on that as well?
Get off mute. Quentin and senators, you were both speaking. I was, thinking about where is it that we find men. I mean, I think, in our careers, we've probably never seen a man walk into a bar spontaneously and say, hey, talk to me about sexual harassment. Talk to me about power and privilege and how I can end white supremacy. How I can end transphobia and homophobia. I mean, we're really good at, in our progressive spaces of articulating that, but the challenge is how do we get to men who don't spontaneously think, yeah, I need to talk about this. And so I think it's all the above. It is parent training as one possibility. We've seen the effectiveness of parent training that focuses on how to raise children in ways that don't reinforce gender norms and they're about positive discipline. It's about workplace training that goes beyond, obviously the 45-minute online check a box and you're done is not it. It is really emancipatory, gender transformative discussions about power kinds of training that needs to be there. It's finding those first-time parents and using that moment when, a lot of men are really concerned and confused. Where am I going? At the moment, we mostly, give you some tips around how to prepare for the birth. How about how to prepare for a journey in caring, connected, nonviolent parenthood? We've tried that in a few places with some success. Getting the health sector to be part of this, to screen for violence, but also to find ways to support, men and pass those messages as well. Coach-based and sports-based stuff, not just, we need some star athletes to call this out as some have, but also like, how do we build this into the coaching? The number of boys and girls who play sports, the role and what their coaches mean to them. It's building it into job training, any place that where we, as Quentin was saying before, where we respond to your need for I need income and lots of other stuff as well. We can add on to those without while meeting your basic needs there. It's looking at trauma. We've got to understand young people who witness violence growing up are far more likely to use it. And that means that's not an excuse for any man's use of violence, but it is to tell us we've got to look at the trauma that men experience in witnessing violence growing up to try to break that cycle. There's some good models on that. Expect Respect out of SAFE Austin has been supported by CDC, replicated in some other settings as a way to say some young men and some young women have more likelihood to either be in a violent relationship later on because of what they've witnessed. We got to think about the psychosocial support. We can use schools and other means to do that. So I think it is to think about all the above. Our roots as an organization, initially in Brazil and then opening an office in the US, comes from a lot of Paulo Freire's approach of consciousness raising education. That this is not just men blindly following along because we tell them, but it's being active citizens, activists, seeing that their joint, their stake in a world that's more just for all, giving them a language to talk about this. And I think it is really important that we help men have words to talk about this, creating those safe spaces and creating a sense that men should be annoyed about this. An awareness raising education that says, I am annoyed and I will take action about it. And I really agree with Stanley about, and I've got a stake in the I think that kind of loop and that feedback loop, I love it when at the end of some of our trainings, men say, damn, I'm really annoyed about this. Kind of like, thank you. That is where we need to get. I want men to be annoyed with the kind of fire in the belly that women feminists have been bringing on for decades. I want men to have that fire in their belly about this.
Thank you. So Stanley, you were talking about, the shift from compliance and, not getting sued or not getting fired. And somebody else, I think, mentioned, not wanting to get rid of somebody who was a value add to the company or the structure. So our culture is hierarchical, and power is about domination, and capitalism and the free market are the drivers. So if we're asking men and society to reimagine these systems, we're not going to say goodbye to capitalism and the free market and hierarchical power anytime soon, right? I'm not saying that's going to happen, but we clearly are making inroads and creating spaces for change. But how do you get the people, if you don't get a guy in the workshop who says, wow, I'm really mad about that, like what you just said, Gary, how do you get people who are clearly benefiting from the current status quo to consider another way? Stanley.
I'm still trying to figure that out with white people. Y'all voted for Trump twice, so I don't have 100% of an answer. But I will say this. One thing I have to remind myself a lot, particularly with Trump and the Republican Party and white supremacy, when I feel myself getting that boiling anger in my chest and I'm about to tweet something that my executive director is going to call me about, is that I have to remember that it's a marathon. It is not a sprint. Change is slow on purpose. To give you an example of what happens when you force things too fast, in 1920, Afghanistan had a king and his queen who decided that they were going to give women the right to education, the right to get a divorce, and the right to own property and get jobs. They were overthrown. Their government was literally overthrown and they were forced to leave or they were going to be killed, right? And not because what they were doing was wrong, it was 1,000% right, but the community just unfortunately was not ready for that. So you have to ask yourself the question of what kind of work do we need to do to get people there? And that's why that shifting in diet and really a rigorous process of educating, learning, pushing, challenging is super important, right? And also there has to be an understanding that this is going to be a marathon. Listen, if I sound like I say smart things and I have a good analysis, I promise you there was an army of exhausted and fed up women somewhere who wasted a lot of emotional and mental energy on me. If you guys could see and hear some of the things I was saying when I was in college, or even right after I graduated from college, I probably wouldn't be on this panel. I had a lot of things to say and all of them were dumb. But I had the time to grow and change. The other thing that I think we need to understand about this is if we really are serious about dismantling patriarchy and sexism, then it's going to be a while, but we got to get serious about dismantling capitalism, because capitalism is surviving off of the structures of racism / white supremacy, patriarchy, and sexism. Let's talk about the origin of patriarchy and the roles of women. It really started to happen when people moved from being just nomads to having farms, farmers and gatherers, right? So the ability to have children was also the ability to create additional work produce. You had people who could help do additional work. So if you had children and you can reproduce, you all of a sudden had hands on deck, which created power. How do you sustain that power? Well, someone has to be able to have the ability to decide what happens to that product that creates the additional employees. Hence, men giving the power over women to therefore make decisions for them, make decisions based on their bodies, their personal choices, and their life choices. But women are fully actualized beings, right? So they're not just going to sit here and be like, totally cool, tell me what to do, control my body, I love it for you. They're going to be like, that's a problem. So how do you sustain that? You stop them from being educated. You don't provide them education. You don't provide them access to power or privilege. You don't provide them access to money, right? You block all those things out. And if you do that, you can sustain it. And we're pretty much functioning as a society off of those basic principles that came. They've evolved continuously to accommodate for the times that we're in here, but that's where it comes from. So how do we get people to understand that and be like, oh, that's pretty dumb? And if we can do that, then we can start to evolve. Okay. It's going to take time. That's okay, though.
Thank you, Stanley. That was a great overview on the history of that. Quentin said he has a few things to respond to as well with that question.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think that is the root of it, right? Because we can break down what the issue is and what the problem is, and make it really creative and package it nicely for men to understand how we kind of show up, and we're part of that. But I would say part of it is to take it beyond the training room, the workshop, is and not to make it a difficult conversation in your first conversation, because some of these trainings, workshops are one time, right? What we developed, I'm glad that the IRL school and the Cornell Workers Institute involved with this, because we created a program that really kind of addressed a lot of the issues that we're talking about, right? And is really having the power in the room. At one point, we had management in the room. We have what we call craft, which is the union representatives. The union represented something totally different from the corporation. Corporation was worried about the liability, the checkoff boxes, the property when workplace violence or domestic violence happened in the workplace. And the unions were really worried about, we want our workers to have jobs and have quality of life and et cetera. So it was a key thing. Like, we had to show the companies the money you lose by not addressing this issue. Then they woke up, right? And for the union folks, it was really about, the social, emotional need as well as the financial. So many things need to be part of that conversation around why are you doing this and how we're going to, roll this out, and what is the conversation going to be? Because we dealt with workplace violence, bullying behavior, domestic violence, and everything in between. On the workplace violence, bullying, and then how relationships can develop in the workplace that should not be developing in the workplace for different reasons. And the other thing I just wanted to kind of mention too is that so that point is about the collaborations, who's at the table, who's working this out, how you rolling out these conversations, and what is the practice like. The other piece is that I've been running a men's roundtable it started with the Chris Brown Rihanna situation, right? And it wasn't about judgment about what Chris Brown did or didn't do, or what quote unquote Rihanna made him do, was what the typical conversation is. I said to the men, if you had an opportunity to talk to Chris Brown, what would you say to him? That was our first question, right? And so many years later, but still having that conversation. So part of it is having a safe space, as much as you can create a safe space for individuals, but to have a place where you can engage in these dialogues, these conversations. So part of it, that was an initiating thing. But the other thing is like, and this is the most cliche thing, I even hate saying it, but meeting people where they are. So meeting men exactly where they are. And a lot of us on this panel, we have a certain level of consciousness and can engage, but the typical person is not even thinking about any of this, but benefiting from the privilege and the entitlements that, that are invisible, right? Because we don't even know we have it sometimes. And it also invisibilizes people on the other end of it. So a lot of it is creating a space where we have these conversations. And I used to run batterers programs and teach people, and I still teach people how to run those groups. So when I first started that, I called it the Men's Domestic Violence Group for Batterers, right? In this agency where we held it. So men weren't coming in saying, my name is Q, I'm a batterer, where's the batterers group, right? So we got to be creative around what we're talking about. and then not just talk about the most egregious thing that we're there for. Start slowly, like it was mentioned, talk about what happened to you. What's going on with you? How did you develop your notions of manhood, fatherhood? And this is regular conversation, using pop culture, whatever it may be. So you get to a place where they're open enough to understand the harm that they do. And also acknowledge that they've been harmed by racism, classism, whatever the form of power where they're not in a point of privilege at. So a lot of it is that. And then the last thing I'll really say is, I think it's maybe a previous question as well. I'm executive director of Connect, and that's only because of in June, my co-executive director retired, right? So we were male, female, black, white, and we had age difference, every intersection you could possibly have. But that dynamic, and I know Gary's been in co-executive or co-leadership spaces in different organizations he's been involved with, and there's so much of an impact with that. And to do that in the gender violence space or the domestic violence space is very rare, to even have men doing this, and then men in leadership and then in co-leadership intentionally, because that modeling, that relationship that you have, people see, wonder about it. How can that even work? And we tell our stories around it, about the processing that we have to go through, leveraging and strategizing about our points of privilege. I have male privilege. I would take the lead after conversation. She had white privilege, so she took the lead around certain places. And some people would invisibilize me and would invisibilize her. And I just want to acknowledge Casey Wagner. She's my other co-conspirator in my workplace violence work. And we have been that same dynamic, a black male and a white woman, really trying to work out how can we work in the workplace and be fair and equitable and mutual. So a lot of these models can be very, very impactful as well, to kind of how do you engage someone? You show them, you talk about it, what are obstacles, and I'll shut up. I know I'm taking a lot of time, but I just want to kind of, share those points.
Thank you, Quentin. And I'm just doing a time check. It's almost 6, and we are going to take some questions from our participants and just shifting. So this is an interesting and timely question. And I'm going to start with the senator just because of your role, but then open it up to all of you. What type of recommendations would you make to our new governor to change the toxic environment in Albany and in government?
Well, that's it's a timely question. It's a great question. It's an important question. There's a bunch of things that I think, that I would urge the, Governor Hochul to consider. Some of them are legislative. There is a really robust legislative agenda that has been put together by the New York Sexual Harassment Working Group. It's, a list of, I believe it's 6 bills or 8 bills that really try to dismantle some of the legal structures that prevent victims from coming forward, from people who have been harassed from coming forward in the first place. It prevents them or intimidates them or it silences their voices, either through the threat of litigation or the threat of a whole bunch of things that I think are really important. Among those are elected official staffs are excluded from workplace protections that that other employees across the state have when it comes to sexual harassment. There was an article in the Albany Times-Union about that this morning, talking about this glaring loophole that exists. So you look at some of the most egregious examples of behavior in Albany, they've happened to staff members for the legislature, for the judicial branch, and then of course we just saw with the executive branch with the former governor himself. Those employees in many cases are not protected by the state's sexual harassment law. Huge glaring loophole. That's just one example. Another example is there's legislation that I carry to ban what we call do not darken clauses in settlement contracts. So what that means is if you are an employee and you file a complaint against a supervisor or a coworker who's harassing you, and you go through the channels, in your workplace, or you bring legal action if it gets to that point, and you sign a settlement agreement, oftentimes in places of employment will make you agree that you can never apply for a job back at that company again. Now, you might think to yourself, okay, if I'm a paralegal at a small 2-person law firm, I don't want to go back and work at that law firm if I had a bad experience there. You're right. You might not want to go back there. But imagine that the example is not the small law firm, it's Google or JP Morgan or Walmart or any of these big companies that have locations around the globe. And all of a sudden you are signing away your right to be able to apply for a job anywhere in the world. Let's say you move cross country, you relocate, and you want to apply to be a bank teller at Chase Bank, and you have a settlement with JP Morgan here in New York, you're banned. That limits your ability to come forward, that limits your options. It's all these structures that exist in the law that make it harder for people to come forward. So I would urge the governor to look at the entire legislative agenda. I just give you 2 of the 8 bills. We'd be here all night talking about them. 2 of the 8 bills. But I also think it goes beyond, like I said earlier, it goes beyond just the legislative actions. It's about setting the tone. The governor has said that she will fire all of the staff members in the executive branch who were implicated in the Attorney General's report, that by name. That needs to happen. The governor said that she wants to clean house, that she wants to set a new tone. I think you do that by showing a different type of leadership, by showing that power does not have to be authoritarian, that you can have forms of power and exercise power in a way that's collaborative, in a way that's empathetic, that still shows people that you can get things done without having to be a bully about it. And that, I think, changes the optics, which doesn't change everything. But once you change the optics, you create the space to then have the hard conversations, both on the policy front, on the legislation, but also to then start sending the message about how we change these cultures in all of these workplaces, in government, out of government, in all of these relationship dynamics, personal and professional. But the leadership has to come from the top. So just like we're talking about the role that men can play in this conversation, the role that all types of leaders can play in these conversations really goes a long way. And the power of words means a lot. Rhetoric means a lot. Examples mean a lot. And when you see people in high places doing the right thing, it just creates a tone and an atmosphere and an environment to let all of the other right things that have to happen kind of start to fall into place. So she's got a lot on her plate. She's got a lot to do. This is a big one. And I really urge, and I'm hopeful, based on what she had said so far, that she's going to take this responsibility seriously.
Thank you, Senator. Anyone else want to jump in on that one?
Just 2 quick things. One, for the sexual harassment law that was passed, I think in 2019. I don't know, I may have missed this from the senator, but I think staff is like, they're exempt from it. Like, they can't use that law. We need to change that immediately. That should be the first thing that happens at the beginning of session in January, like the first thing. The second thing is, I think that, like, we're talking about state level politics. I think one of the best ways that we can help people protect themselves is with the union. And I think it's not a good reflection of our values when we have people working at the state Senate and the state assembly and at the Capitol who have no union representation. And we should be urging them, just like the city council just did with them, with the Stafford unions. We should be urging folks to get unions, because when you are in a situation where we have these policies and procedures, but you don't have any support or you don't have perceived support, it can be very intimidating to reach out for it. And one of the most important things you can have is union representation, because you talk to your union rep and they can make the fuss for you. So I would strongly encourage, like, there really be an uptick in pushing for unionization of staff at the state capitol, particularly central staff and staff for senators and assembly members.
Thank you, Stanley. And we're getting some comments that it also needs to happen at the local government, because at the local and county levels, egregious behavior goes on unchecked. So the thing about unions is, yeah, it creates a structure, an infrastructure, and how and a process. But of course, that larger piece, the cultural piece, is still prevalent.
I just say that the loophole that I talked about, that Stanley then referenced, exists at all levels of government. Yeah. And so we do have legislation to try to close that loophole. It's a bill that I carry. It would also apply to local governments as well, because the same loophole exists at that local level too.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that, Senator. All right, now switching gears back to more of the macro. Someone's asking for you men to share what were some of the, I guess, tipping points or pinnacle moments, in your lives. I think Stanley spoke to that a little bit earlier about that led you to this transformative behavior. I mean, Stanley talked about all the women. They didn't waste their time, Stanley. They were invested in you. You were an investment. And now we're reaping the benefit of that investment. So share a little personal story about, maybe an example of what was a tipping point for you.
Okay. A big tipping point for me, and this is not a thing I'm proud of, but I think it's true for a lot of men. There was a year, it was 2017 actually, where at least 4 women I knew were in abusive relationships. And I knew the men. And sorry about that, folks. And the thing that really stood out to me is like I knew the men, and I realized that like the traits that I saw in these men who were abusers and vicious abusers is like I 100% could relate to them. There was not much of a difference in thought process or behavior with these men and me. And we like to believe these like people who commit sexual assault or who abuse women, like we think of them as like these like caricatures of men, but no, they're just like us. And when I realized that, I had to take a deep, long, hard look at myself and say, why haven't I gone this route? What was the difference? And once I could see myself in those men, like I felt I could have empathy. And I was like, like we got to do something. And so like, I'm trying to like, I know what it's like. I think a lot of men and boys feel really angry. We feel ignored. We don't feel like anybody cares about us. I'll say like, I was in the panel the other day where a white kid said to me, he's like, everyone's blaming white men. They're mad at white men. We get all the blame for this. And like, my parents didn't own slaves. Like, my parents didn't own slave part. Let's put that aside. But that anger he feels, that feeling of being ostracized and being left out, men across the racial diaspora feel that right now. And that anger and that isolation and the inability to articulate or express our emotions because we're told that that is a bad thing and there are real consequences to actually expressing emotions and feelings, that gets pent up and it turns into rage. And where does that rage go to? To the people closest to us. And I've been really lucky that I didn't get there. But once again, lots of patient women, lots of Eminem, which I probably shouldn't listen to him too much, and lots of reading. So that was my tipping point. And that's when I started like having weekly meetings with men and talk about this. And so I'm trying to write and think about it, to process my own trauma and healing and share with others.
Thank you, Stanley. Gary, you were nodding your head. Would you please share maybe a pinnacle moment for you?
Yeah, I mean, Stanley, I absolutely agree, was listening to women and well, friend girls and girlfriends all had a story of the harm caused by men. And, I think to be humble enough to go, oh, wait, man, I think, I can remember back when I did this without even thinking about it. And contrast that with, I had the benefit of a father who made care his profession. And so I had, this kind of, oh yeah, that's the model I need to look at. I mean, I feel tremendously privileged with that model of caring manhood was around me up until he passed not too long ago. So I think those to me were moments of like, wait, this is deliberate. There is a way of being a man, not just sort of coasting along, and particularly, white, middle-class, cisgender, heterosexual, there's a lot we can just coast along and we're thought to be competent or somehow useful. So to say, wait a minute, there is work that is required here, and I've got to get to it. And that, hanging out with amazing feminist women and feeling like, oh yeah, what you just said about not being reduced, to your biological makeup, I get to be a better man if I, get to express my full range of emotions. If I can step away and say, I don't believe in those ways of manhood, I get to be a freer, connected human being. So absolutely agree. I just wanted to say one thing about the what needs to happen in Albany. There's a lot of legislation, but I think there's also some basic practices of what does accountability look like? The most junior, most vulnerable staff in your organization need to have a place where they get listened to in a guaranteed way, whether that's an accountability committee, an annual checkup that you have to do, and that information has got to be public. I need to know that if I'm the governor or if I'm head of an office over here, that I'm being watched. And I know that I'm going to be judged not just by those that I can sort of hide from, but the most junior staff around me. I think we need to figure out ways that we can do that. And I think on the, there's a lot of stuff that a legal approach can bring us. But a restorative practice and the kind that Quentin practices with men who have carried out violence, we need to do that around harassment as well, which means, we send violent men often, behind the scenes, and we don't talk about them anymore, and they go away in shame, which sometimes is quite useful. But we also need to keep them in the room to acknowledge and find ways that they can restore and apologize in meaningful ways for the harm they've caused. And our legal processes don't usually provide for that, but for healing to go on, both for survivors and for perpetrators to be pulled back into their humanity, we've got to have more creative restorative processes that probably keep the lawyers one step, beyond, as important as they are. I think that's a key for me as well.
Thank you, Gary. And on that note, we're at 6:11 and I'm being instructed to wrap it up. Great comments. I just can't thank you all enough. What a rich exchange of ideas, and looking forward to synthesizing this into something that we can really move on. And thank you. I'm going to hand it over to Bev now, and thank you all.
Thank you to our panelists. Really was an excellent conversation. You were so open in your comments, and I think that really, helped people understand the issue better, the ramifications, how difficult it is for men, how do you reach men. So that kind of openness is probably a sign of why you're doing this work. But we thank you for that, thank you for doing this work and for talking to us today about it. I just want to say that there's so many resources that that you all have. We're going to follow up with the audience and have those 6 bills or 8 bills, Senator. We'll put that together. We really would love links from your organizations and things that people can read. Many of us are dealing with learning more about racism, and a lot of people are reading and then talking about it. So maybe there's some things that we can share with our community so that we can have a deeper understanding. So we'll get back to people about that. I'll also send you a link to the group for part 1 of this series, so you can see, how we're developing it. And I just want to just close by saying some thank yous. Thank you to our speakers, Senator Gounardes, Stanley Fritz, Wayne Barker, Quentin Walcott, and Karen King. Thank you, Karen, for not just moderating, but formulating this conversation today. Also, Mary Luke, Vice President of Programming, Abby Grimshaw, our online manager, and one of our super volunteers, Nancy Hafner. We really appreciate all the work you put into it and all the thought that really went into this particular program. So I couldn't possibly bring this all together. All I can say is that we will send some good materials because we want the conversation to continue. And that's what we commit to. You are all saying, stand up, speak out, be there. Well, POWHER will be there. We want to continue this. Karen has all sorts of ideas for the next part of our series, and we'll be back with that. So we will have institutional courage, and we're asking everybody who is listening to also have your courage and speak your truth. And I think together we can make inroads into this and make everybody's lives a lot better. So we thank you, and we're going to close now. And please feel free to send any questions that you want to give to the panelists to info@powherny.org. And that's all we have is thank you. A big thank you to everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. Great. Thank you.